Hello, my name is Rob Earlam, Senior Developer Advocate at Sitecore, and this video is the first in a two-part series introducing a brand new JavaScript SDK for Sitecore Discover. So let's get going. So we're going to cover a few things in part one today. We're going to start by talking about the different implementation options you have available when working with Sitecore Discover. Then we're going to drill down into the JavaScript SDK itself and take a little look at what's included. After that, we're going to talk through the eventing model, which will conclude this video. After this, there's going to be a part 2 released, which is then going to dig into the component model and show how you can leverage that to integrate catalog data into your Discover site. So when it comes to how to integrate with Discover, you've actually got 3 different approaches. The first option is hosted pages. With this approach, you provision a reverse proxy for some of your application routes, or maybe even a subdomain some of our customers do. What happens is that is then pointed directly to the Discover servers, and those pages are served by Discover in their entirety. Now, the first thing I want to call out with this is you'll see it appears quite low on the developer effort axis. And that's because once you provision this reverse proxy or subdomain, the developer no longer has to be involved. All of this can then be configured by the merchandiser from within the admin section of Sitecore Discover, the Customer Engagement Center, otherwise known as the CEC. The other thing to notice about this is that it also doesn't appear too far along the horizontal axis, which is the feature set availability axis. So what you gain in ease of implementation, there is a few drawbacks in that not the full feature set of Sitecore Discover is actually available to you at that time. The next option is kind of the polar opposite to this, and that's the direct API integration. Straight away, you'll see this appears much higher on the developer effort axis. And that's because your developer has to be involved throughout the process here. They're manually calling all the APIs themselves, crafting all of these commerce experiences for you. I will call out though that you'll notice it's all the way to the right on the horizontal axis. So by having that more developer-centric approach, you do get the full feature set of Discover being available to you then. Luckily, there is a middle ground between these two though, and that's what we're here to talk about today. That's the new JavaScript SDK being released for Sitecore Discover. As with the API first approach, you get the full feature set that Sitecore Discover has available to you. But there's much less developer effort required. A lot of the boilerplate type code, a lot of the repetitive API calling code, all of that's handled for you now compared to the direct API integration. So it's going to reduce your development time quite significantly compared to that. So let's take a look at the SDK and what's included with it. Now this SDK is a React library. So if you're building with React itself or a framework based on React like Next.js, this is going to be the way you want to go. Now, if you're building with another JavaScript library, maybe you're in Angular or Vue or Svelte, or maybe you're in another language altogether, maybe you're in .NET or Go, this isn't going to be available for you. You're going to have to choose one of those other 2 development approaches that we just discussed. What the SDK does give you though is complete control over how you can design your commerce catalog experiences. As I'll show you shortly, you can decide how much responsibility lies with the developer compared to the merchandiser for each component, and you can dial that responsibility back between the 2 parties. It comes with 2 main elements. The eventing element, which we're going to discuss in this video, is part of the React NPM package, and then you get the component elements, which are part of the UI package, which is what we're going to discuss in part 2 of this series. Before I dig into this in too much though, I just want to talk a little bit about the scenario we're going to be working with throughout both of these videos. Now, obviously you can take Sitecore Discover and this SDK and integrate it in a brand new greenfield project. It's really easy to do so. But what I wanted to do is show just how easy it is to take the SDK and use it to integrate Sitecore Discover into an existing storefront. And to do that, we're going to be using Next.js Commerce with Order Cloud on the back end, providing the commerce functionality. I like this example because Next.js is open source, it's free and available for you to use. And you can also go and create a trial account and a sandbox with Order Cloud, so you can get Next.js Commerce stood up really quickly. It also shows us the benefits you get when combining static site generation, which you get with Next.js, with dynamic rendering functionality you'll get with Sitecore Discover, getting the best of both those worlds combined together. So when you look at a scenario like that, how do the different architectural pieces come together? Well, when you build a site with Next.js and host it in Vercel, what Vercel is going to do is it's going to pull your code out of your GitHub repository or any other repository you're using, and it's going to combine that with your commerce data, in this case coming from Order Cloud. What Vercel is then going to do is it's going to pre-render all of your pages. And they're all going to be cached as static assets on their CDN, globally cached. You then come along with your browser, you request a page from the site, and this statically generated assets, pre-built at build time, are returned blazingly fast from the edge. This is basically what static site generation is. You're offloading the effort of compiling and building these pages to build time, so when it comes to runtime and user requests, they're happening lightning fast. When it comes to e-com storefronts, there's a lot of interactivity though, so while the initial page load happens via static site generation, you're going to maybe be making calls back to the e-com engine. For this, you can think about things like adding products to your cart or going through the checkout flow, for example. Now, it may not be a direct call from your browser to the e-com engine. There may be some middleware or a service involved in the middle, but in all effects and purposes, it's you updating data in the e-com engine from your browser based on the interactions you're having. This point here is what Next.js Commerce looks like. If you go and stand up Next.js Commerce with AutoCloud, this is the setup you're going to get. What we're going to be doing across these two videos, though, is introducing Sitecore Discover alongside this. The first thing we're going to be doing in this video is integrating the SDK into our Next.js application and using it to capture eventing data, showing what our users are doing on the site. Then, in part two, we're going to use that event data we've caught to return personalized catalog experiences to provide really contextual catalog listing to their users based on their prior browsing activities. Mostly across this two-part series, though, we're going to be focusing on these elements here. The user's interactions with Discover sending data and getting catalog data back out of it again. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the first piece, the eventing piece. And when you're implementing Discover into a new or an existing site, this is going to be where you're going to want to start. And it means you can deploy this out straight away. Start collecting this event data, because what that's going to do is it's then going to be used on the back end to start to train the AI built into Sitecore Discover. This means that you can deploy this now and start collecting data for days, weeks, or months afterwards. And then at a future date, if you deploy a component, let's say a most popular products component, as soon as you deploy the component, it's going to be populated based on real data, because you're going to have been collecting data over that period of time in between deploying the eventing piece and then deploying your component afterwards. Now, all these events are built into the SDK, but some of them are wired up for you, and some of them are going to have to be triggered yourselves from within your React application. As you can see in the tables here, the one on the right, they're automatically wired up by the SDK, but the ones on the left, you're going to have to connect yourselves. The reason for that is the ones on the left are more involved generally. They involve an event model you've got to put together. Most likely, most of the time, it involves getting the SKU for the product being used. Everyone's model for every e-com implementation is different, so there's no way to manually wire that up. The event calls all exist for you in the SDK, but you need to physically call them and pass the SKU in from your event model. And we'll take a look at that shortly. The ones on the right, though, as I said, as soon as you integrate the SDK, they're all going to happen for you without you having to do anything else. Both of these tables are available on the Sitecore documentation site, so if you want to refer back to them later, you can do that there. Okay, so I think it's time we start to write some code. So I've loaded up VS Code here. And for anyone who hasn't worked with Next.js Commerce before, this is the structure of a Next.js Commerce site. And we have the site folder in here, which is where our actual Next.js application exists, and it's where we're going to be doing most of our work today. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to get this site running in the background. To do that, I'm going to load up the site folder, and then it uses the pnpm package manager. So I'm going to run pnpm dev, which is going to give us a developer instance of the site running locally on my machine that we can access from browser. I'll get rid of the terminal for now because we don't need that quite yet. So if we hop over to a browser now, we can go to localhost 3000. And here is Next.js Commerce. This is a statically generated storefront with AutoCloud on the back end, running in development mode locally, so it's not going to generate all the pages, it's going to build them as I make the request. But if I was to deploy this out to Vercel or another hosting provider, then it would all be statically generated. And you can see it's a pretty standard B2C storefront. We have a catalog loaded here with sporting goods, so we've got things around golf and cycling and the like. And it's a pretty standard storefront that we'd all be used to using day to day. So as we discussed before, what we want to do first is to integrate our SDK into the application to start capturing all that rich event data which the SDK includes. So to do that, we're going to hop back to VS Code and we're going to start making a few changes to the site. So I'm going to load up my pages folder here, and I'm going to load up the underscore app page. And this is a special component that basically wraps all the different routes on the site. So anything I add in here is going to get executed for every route there is. And we're going to start by wrapping the entire application in a widget provider. This is the main entry point for the SDK. So I'm going to pull in my references, and you can see it comes out of the React library. I'm also going to pull in the environment type. And you can see here, I'm passing in some parameters as well. So you can see I'm passing in the environment, we're working in production, and I've previously generated a customer key and an API key, which is how my application here identifies and ties itself to a specific instance of Discover. So I can save that now, and that's all we have to do. Remember, we said earlier on that a lot of the events are wired up for us. As soon as we wrap our application in that widget provider, that process happens. So we can go back to the browser now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the developer tools for the site. What we'll do is we'll refresh the page, and I'm on the network tab here, which is going to show us all the requests for that page. I'm also refining by XHR fetch requests, so all the dynamic requests that happen. And we can see some now which go over to the API rfksrv.com. That's the domain for Discover. The first one is getting an access token, validating this application should be able to connect to Discover. And then we start to see our event data going over. We can see this event here automatically wired up for us. And we can see the name is page and its type is view. So this is a page view event handled for us. The key thing here though is this UUID. This is my unique identifier as a customer. As I browse through the site, that's going to tie all my actions to my individual record on the back end, and it's persisted in a cookie. You can do some pretty cool things with that though. If I hop over to the CEC now, and I'm going to go over to my developer resources, and I'm going to go to the event monitor tab. What we can do is we can paste our UUID into here and click start monitoring. Now, if I go back to the site, refresh that page once more, you get a live trace of whatever that user has been performing on the site appearing live in the CEC. So if we hop back over here, we can see our page view event now being displayed. So you can see these events are automatically wired up for us. But as I said, there are some you're going to have to wire up yourselves. So let's take a look at a couple of those in action. The first of those is a product detail view page. So if we hop back to the application now, I'm going to go and load up the product/slug page. And this is the main page that's used for our product detail page. And we're going to paste a few different bits of code into here. What we're going to do is we're going to make use of the use effect hook in React. So let's just add that in. I'll import that from the React library. And then I'll import this function call from the SDK React library. And this is what you call to track a PDP event. Remember we said before, these events you wire up yourselves are a little more complex. Most of the time it revolves around passing a specific SKU involved. And that's what we're doing here. The ID of the product being viewed is passed into the track PDP view event function. We can save that, and then we can hop back to our application. And we'll go to our site, and then we'll load up this set of golf clubs here. You can see the page loaded, and we have another request over to the API server. We can load that in and see the data, and this time it's a little different. We can see we have a PDP, product detail page this time, and a view event, so it's a view of the product detail page. We can also go and expand the event details and see the SKU that was passed in, make sure it's correct. Remember, we're still tracking events in the CEC here though, so what we can do is we can go and see this event was called. And we can expand the event details and see that model that was passed in. If we scroll down, we can see it's a PDP event, we can see the view events there, and we can see the UUID passed as well, along with the SKU for the product itself. Okay, so that was pretty straightforward. I think the next one I'm going to have a look at is tracking when a product's added to the cart. So let's go back to our application now. This one happens inside one of the components in the app. So we're going to load up our components folder. Then we're going to go into product and product sidebar. Now there's a few pieces we're going to have to add into here. We need to pass the path when we're calling the add to cart function from the SDK. So to do that, we're going to add in a reference to the use router library from Next. And that will basically allow us to get access to the path that this component is being rendered on. From there, we could add this functionality to track the event into the use effect hook again. But that'll get called every time the component's loaded, and that's not actually what we want. We want to call the function every time the product's added to the cart. So we need to add it in a slightly different place. What we're going to do here is we're going to hook into the main add to cart function here. We're going to let the existing code all execute first. We're going to hook in afterwards, and we're going to add our Discover code in here to track that event in Discover. Again, we're going to add in a reference to our event model. Then we're going to add in a reference to our track card event. What we're doing here, we're actually building a full event model out. You can see we're passing in the SKU, the ID of the product. We're passing in the quantity. In this case, we're just hard coding it to 1, but you could add that from a drop down and make it dynamic if you required. And then we're adding the price that it was valid at. We then send that model over in the function along with the path as well, showing where this was executed from. So we can save this now and hop back to our site. Now I need to refresh the page again because I need to reload that component. You'll wonder why we're adding path as well, and that's because a lot of e-commerce storefronts allow you to add to cart from different locations. Maybe not only on the product detail page, but also on the product listing page. So being able to add that extra piece of data in there can help give you valuable information on how your users are interacting with your site. So we can see the page is loaded now, and I can hit the add to cart button. The first call that happens actually goes over to our e-com system, to Order Cloud to physically add it to the cart. But you'll see afterwards we get another call through to Discover. We can go and take a look at this information here, and we can see its type now is A2C, add to cart. We can also see all of that event data in the event model we created. The SKU's there, the price is there, and the quantity's there as well. So let's hop over to the CEC now and see these events in here. And you can see we have our add to cart being rendered out. And we have 2 created here. You'll notice one is generated by the customer and one is generated by Sitecore. If we take a look at the event details here, we can go through and we can see all the model data in there that we passed in. This record here that's generated by the customer represents the event being added to a queue on the back end. If we go and take a look at the event generated by Sitecore, we'll see the same event data in here, but the ones generated by Sitecore represent the event being taken off the queue in the back end. Some events are more complex and require queue processing like this, and you may see double logging in the event monitor, but you can rest assured it'll only be a single record in your actual analytics that you're working with. And from here, what I do next is I'd continue to wire up the rest of the events that are manually configured, and then I'd go and deploy this site out to production, and I'd start collecting all that rich analytics data ready for us to work with the component library later on. So that brings us to the end of part 1 of this video series. Please tune into the second part where we're going to start to use all this analytics data to start to create really contextual product interactions into that same storefront we just looked at. Thanks for listening.